Picture yourself sitting around a campfire. 100,000 years ago, you were freezing, you were starving, and something is waiting, massive and hairy, lurking just outside the light. You want to warn your buddy across the flames, so you do what any modern human would. You open your mouth, but absolutely nothing comes out. Because here is the truth nobody talks about. There was once a time, a real, documented, scientifically proven era when humans could not speak. Not a single word. Not even a useful grunt. Just absolute, biological silence. And the mystery of how we went from that. From being a creature staring blankly at a mammoth, to the species that invented podcast drama, political arguments, and the line, "I am fine," when we are clearly not okay. That mystery is one of the most mind-blowing puzzles in all of science, and we are going to explore it today. Let us start with the problem. Unlike fossils, unlike tools, unlike cave paintings, language leaves absolutely no physical trace. You cannot dig up a fossil and find a sentence. You cannot carbon date a conversation. Spoken language is made of air, and air does not preserve very well over massive geological timescales. So, scientists investigating the origin of speech are basically forensic linguists, piecing together an evolutionary puzzle from whatever clues they can find. Skull shapes, throat anatomy, genetic mutations, cave art, and plenty of educated guessing. And those educated guesses are extraordinary. First, we need to get one thing straight. What exactly is language? Because before we had actual spoken language, we definitely had some system. Animals communicate, which is not up for debate. Bees do a little waggle dance to tell their hive where the best flowers are, while dolphins use signature whistles acting just like names. Chimpanzees in the wild rely on unique calls and physical gestures to share basic details. So, the big question isn't when creatures started communicating. The question is, when did that communication become actual language? When did we cross over from signal to symbol? Because there is a massive, fundamental difference between those two. A signal is direct, it means just one thing. A dog growls because it feels threatened. That growl is the threat, but a symbol is abstract. The word danger is just a random arrangement of sounds that common agreement represents a specific concept. The word doesn't sound like danger. It doesn't look like trouble. We just collectively agreed at some point that those specific vibrations in the air would mean that exact thing. That is wild when you actually think about it. Every word you have ever spoken is a social illusion that billions of people happen to share, and taking that leap from mere signal to symbol, from direct reaction to abstract meaning, was the cognitive revolution that changed everything. Now, scientists do not agree on exactly when this happened, and honestly, that is what makes this so fascinating. There are two main sides, and they have debated this for decades. One side argues language evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, slowly developing from basic calls into full grammar. This is the continuity theory, and its supporters point to our evolutionary cousins, chimps, bonobos, and gorillas, who already show basic symbolic thinking. They can master signs and combine symbols in new ways. They seem to understand that objects have names, so maybe language is just the end point of a long road that started way back. Kant says something totally different. They claim there was this moment, a sudden leap, probably somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, when something just clicked inside the human brain, a genetic mutation, or maybe a threshold of brain complexity that suddenly unlocked full, complex recursive syntax, the unique power to embed ideas inside other. The man who I think knows the woman who lost his dog. That kind of complexity. Sentences inside of sentences inside sentences. And before that moment, we had absolutely nothing like it. This is the discontinuity hypothesis, and if it's true, human language didn't just grow. It erupted. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, involving several different pieces coming together at different points. Let's look at the physical body first, because speech isn't just a mental process, it is deeply physical. To make all the distinct sounds that build up human speech, you need a highly specific vocal anatomy. For most of evolutionary history, our early ancestors simply lacked it. The crucial piece is the larynx, your voice box, and more importantly, its position in the throat. For most mammals, including our evolutionary cousins, the chimps, the larynx sits high up in the throat. This is actually incredibly useful for them. It means they can breathe and swallow food at the same time, reducing any choking hazard. Pretty practical and efficient. But it heavily limits the range of vocal sounds they can make. In humans, our larynx sits much lower. This design forms a larger resonating chamber, the pharynx, which is what lets us produce that wide range of vowels and consonants, making complex speech possible. To massive trade-off, we choke. We are literally the only mammal that regularly dies from inhaling food. Every year, thousands of people choke to death on things like half-chewed steak, overly ambitious sandwiches. Evolution looked at our ability to talk and said, yes, worse the risk of dying from a rogue piece of bread. The descent of the larynx probably happened solely over millions of years, and different species of the genus Homo having it to varying degrees. But here is catch. Throat positions do not preserve in fossils. Soft tissue does not fossilize. So, we are back to guessing and estimating. What actually lasts is bone. And there is one bone in particular that gives us clues: the hyoid. This bone is a tiny, U-shaped bone in your throat that anchors the muscles used for speaking and swallowing. It is the only bone in our entire body that does not connect to any other bone. It just floats right there, held by muscles and tendons. And because of how it connects to the muscles used for speaking, its shape reveals quite a bit about an early human's actual vocal ability. In 1989, a complete hyoid was found at a Neanderthal grave at Kibara Cave in Israel. It was 60,000 years old. And when researchers studied its shape, they made a shocking discovery. It was almost identical to a modern human hyoid. This was a massive deal. It strongly hinted that Neanderthals, our stocky, heavy-browed cousins who lived throughout Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, actually had the physical ability to talk. And then, the DNA experts weighed in and things got interesting. In 2002, researchers found a gene called FOXP2, and it instantly became famous. Maybe too famous, because the media began calling it the language gene, which is honestly a huge oversimplification that made real geneticists quietly scream. But the reason behind that nickname is very real. Humans with damaged copies of FOXP2 face severe struggles with speech and language. They struggle to coordinate the precise muscle movements needed for speaking. They even battle with grammar. It is a genuinely tough condition. What made this discovery so explosive was this: our human version of FOXP2 is different from what we see in other mammals, including chimpanzees. Even mice have FOXP2. Songbirds have FOXP2. Even crocodiles have it. But the human variant has two unique mutations that never appear anywhere else in the animal kingdom. Mutations that seem to have undergone rapid evolutionary selection, meaning nature really wanted us to have them. And then scientists tested Neanderthal genes. They had actual fossil DNA that they extracted from ancient bones. When they looked at that FOXP2 gene, the Neanderthals had the same exact mutations as us, which means Neanderthals and modern humans shared this genetic blueprint for speech. And since our lineages split from a common ancestor for 100,000 years ago, FOXP2 must have been present in that common ancestor too, or it evolved independently in both groups, which would be an unbelievable coincidence that most scientists refuse to buy into. So, where does that leave us? By 400,000 years ago, maybe earlier, our ancestors had the genetics for the physical coordination needed for speech. By 60,000 years ago, the latest, Neanderthals had the physical throat biology that could support intricate talking. And sometime before that, somewhere down the line leading to us, our brain had rewired itself for symbolic speech. But none of this explains what those first words actually were. And that is where things get wonderfully bizarre, because we have several competing theories. And some of them are totally hilarious. The oldest and most silly theory is called the Bow Wow theory. The premise is simple. Those first words were copies of sounds in the world. You see a dog. You say something like the sound it makes. You hear thunder. You name it after that noise. This is called onomatopoeia. And it is real. Words like crash, buzz, and hiss are clearly based on the sounds they copy. But that can only account for a tiny portion of vocabulary. You cannot really mimic your way to words like justice, or logic, or bureaucracy. At some point, We need random symbols. Then there is the poo-poo theory. Yes, that is its official name. This idea suggests that language started from instinctive emotional noises. The ouch when you stub your toe, a sigh of relief, a laugh. And while these sounds are clearly ancient and deeply built into our biology, they are also mostly automatic and uncontrolled, which makes it tough to see how they turned into real, structured speech. We have the yo-he-ho theory, which suggests that rhythmic grunts may, during shared physical work, moving a heavy log, rowing together, pulling a rope, gave birth to the rhythmic structures behind speech. Think of sea shanties as living fossils of early speech. Actually, real truth to this, music and language share a massive real estate in our brains. In fact, many experts believe they evolved together, which means that singing actually came first. Then there is the Tata theory, which is honestly pretty fascinating. It says that speech started as vocal imitations of hand gestures. Imagine early humans waving their hands while their lips unconsciously mimic the movements, slowly turning physical signs into spoken words. This wild idea is mostly rejected now, but it still reminds us that early language science actually included naming theories after total nonsense syllables, that the gesture hypothesis, meaning the idea that communication grew out of hand and body gestures, is taken way more seriously. Why? Well, look at our biology. The area of the brain governing speech in modern humans, Broca's area, is closely wired directly to parts controlling the fine motor movements of our hands. In other primates, this very same region is busy handling physical hand gestures and facial expressions. That link is no coincidence. Plus, many parts of speech make way more sense. Pointing is probably our most basic communication tool. It says, "Look at that thing over there." And pointing with a finger seems to be purely human, or maybe shared with captive apes. Chimps in the wild almost never point. Even babies point long before they talk. There is a strong case that human speech began with our hands, and voices caught up later, which leads us to the most overlooked part of the entire evolutionary story, the social brain. You can have the perfect anatomy, or the FOXP2 gene, plus vocal cords, a low larynx, and Broca's area all wired up and ready to speak. But none of that matters unless you also have the cognitive setup required for what communication actually needs: theory of mind. This is basically the ability to realize that other people have their own thoughts and motives that differ entirely from yours. It is the ability to read another mind and language. Real conversation, not just basic signaling, absolutely requires this. Think about it. When I speak to you, I am not just making random noise. I am making a sound with the explicit hope that you will understand my goal of sharing a particular idea. That is a sentence I just uttered, and it is wild when you break it down. Dialogue is built on a sort of social telepathy. I am trusting that you can read my mind, and you are trusting that I want to be understood. This is something that wild animals seem to completely lack, or at least have in a highly limited form. When a chimpanzee communicates, it is usually asking for food or reacting to danger. It is not trying to share gossip for the sake of just sharing. This cooperative exchange of knowledge, like telling a friend about what happened yesterday morning, describing a cool place you visited, or wondering about the future, that all seems to require deep social cognition that is uniquely, radically human. And strangely, the growth of this social smarts seems to tie directly to something else that was going on in our evolutionary history: a sudden, massive spike in community size. Around 500,000 years ago, our early ancestors lived in tiny tribes. By 100,000 years ago, our ancient tribes were growing larger and complex. Imagine managing relationships in huge groups. It meant tracking way more people, their alliances, their histories. Who do you trust? Some experts, like the famous evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar, say we evolved language specifically to solve this massive social headache. He called it social grooming. By other means, chimpanzees bond with each other by literally picking bugs off each other. Cute. But it does not scale when you have 150 folks. Language lets you connect with multiple people at once. Gossip, essentially, was evolution's ultimate killer app for communication. Once we had that, the feedback loops went totally wild. Talking allowed much better coordination, which built bigger, more complex societies. Larger and more complex cultures created more information that had to be shared, putting pressure on speech to become sharper and far more powerful. Sharper speech let us pass down wisdom across generations, not just showing someone how to nap a flint, but providing actual instructions, the explanations, and the stories embedding that knowledge to let it travel through time. Once that wisdom accumulate over generations instead of being reinvented every time. Cultural evolution exploded at a pace biology simply could not match. The moment speech crystallized, the entire game changed. Suddenly, humans could coordinate with strangers, plan months ahead, and even lie, which is a highly underrated mental superpower, allowing us to create complex myths, stories, gods, and social rules that glued large groups of unrelated strangers together into working societies. Everything that followed, farming, cities, writing, science, the internet, and this video, goes back to that first instant when an early human another person and made a sound. They both fully understood to mean the same thing. When did this happen? Nobody knows. We still do not know where. Though Africa is our best universal bet, we cannot know what that first spoken word was, and we probably never will. Yet we can say, with pretty good confidence, that by 70,000 years ago, our ancestors suddenly started doing things that looked completely different from anything before: crafting art, cool jewelry, and high-tech tools, and trading across massive distances. Clearly, language was there, fully working, turning single minds into one giant project. This behavioral boom that scientists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution is, in many ways, simply the visible footprint of human speech. Take the Chavit paintings, 36,000 years old, showing beasts with motion, depth, and a narrative. These came from minds that had rich stories. Think of Venus figurines scattered around Europe, those flutes carved from vulture bone, and the careful styling of red paint and shells as personal fashion. All of these are the creations of a species that had learned to take ideas from inside their heads and make them real in our world. That is what speech does. It shares our thoughts, it makes the hidden seen, the passing things permanent, the lonely shared. But here is the thing that should truly blow your mind. Every language, look at the 7,000 languages spoken today, from Mandarin to Swahili, Basque, or even the click languages of the Kalahari Desert. Every last one of them, despite their wildly different sounds, shares a deep mental blueprint that scientists believe is hardwired in our very brains. Noam Chomsky called this universal grammar, the crazy idea that every language is fundamentally the same, just wearing different outfits, since they sprout from the exact same internal mental software. Think about it. Babies everywhere, in every culture and situation, pick up speech the same way, just as fast, hitting the exact same milestones. An infant in Tokyo, another in Lagos, and a baby in Sao Paulo will start by babbling, then say single words, then short two-word phrases, then full sentences on almost the exact same timeline, without anyone actually teaching them any rules of grammar. The software is already installed. It was built by human evolution, and that incredible, mind-blowing superpower, absolutely game-changing, didn't happen overnight. It came from evolutionary accidents and shifting survival pressures molding our brains and bodies for millions of years. A larynx that dropped, a sudden genetic mutation, a brain that rewired itself for social connection, and a species needing to keep track of who owed favors to whom around those growing, chatty campfires. All of this happened so that, one day, in Africa, two early humans could look at each other in the dark, and one could whisper, "Hey, watch out, something is out there," and the other would actually understand. That is the origin of language. That is where everything began. Not with deep poetry, or complex philosophy, or sweet love songs, though, and those came fast enough, to people sharing a vital piece of information that actually mattered. Two minds touching across the dark. When you really think about it, isn't that what language is? Every time we speak,